In the case study entitled Troublesome Trinkets, our author describes an example of sweatshop labor that was reported in the New York Times in 2003. The report describes a factory in China where many workers become ill from breathing in dust produced from cutting stones that are used in children's toys and pretend jewelry. It is very common to criticize these sorts of labor practices, and there are of course good reasons for doing so. However, in this video I want to analyze the issue more closely to determine the specific moral worry that is present here and that underlines our intuitions about our moral uneasiness. After all, despite the low pay and poor working conditions, sweatshop labor does seem to present the best available employment option for those who choose it. Given this, the question we are looking at is it wrong of a company to offer such an employment arrangement? More specifically, there are two separate questions that I want to examine. The first question is sweatshop labor coercive? And the second question is sweatshop labor exploitative? We will begin with the former question. To say that sweatshop laborers have been coerced would be to say that in some sense they have been forced into the labor arrangement. Now at first we might say that that can't be the case since sweatshop labor presents again the best available option for those who decide to take it. However, the mere fact that some option is the best available for someone does not mean that that person hasn't been coerced into taking it. For example, imagine a victim who is threatened at gunpoint to hand over their wallet to a thief. In this situation, given the threat of violence, the victim's best available option is to give up their wallet, because losing their wallet is better than losing their life. Yet despite this, it is still clearly true that the victim in this scenario has been coerced into giving up their money. They didn't really do so of their own free will. So is sweatshop labor like this? In some ways it is, but there are also some important differences. One critical difference is that unlike the thief, the company offering sweatshop labor did not create the situation that causes laborers to make the highly undesirable choice. The company offering the labor is not responsible for the vulnerability and poor economic conditions that the laborer finds herself in. The thief, on the other hand, is responsible for the fact that the victim finds herself in a vulnerable position in the first place. She wouldn't be in that situation if the thief hadn't threatened her at gunpoint. This is a significant difference, and thus it is not clear that the offer of sweatshop labor is necessarily coercive, at least not as necessarily and strongly coercive as in the thief example. Still, even though the company did not create the vulnerable position of the sweatshop laborers, the company does take advantage of that pre-existing vulnerability. And this brings us to the second question. Is sweatshop labor exploitative? It is common to claim that in fact it is, but to evaluate this claim, we first need a definition of exploitation, and we can define exploitation in the following way. A exploits B when A gains by 1, taking advantage of B's disadvantageous circumstance, and in doing so 2, inflicts an undeserved loss upon B. Now, given this definition, does sweatshop labor exploit workers? It certainly does seem to meet criterion 1. Sweatshop labor takes advantage of the vulnerable circumstances of sweatshop laborers insofar as the companies offering such labor arrangements only offer them because they know there are people desperate enough to accept them. Again, these companies do not create this vulnerability. The vulnerability pre-exists anything the companies have done, but they do leverage that vulnerability to their own advantage. In the case study, it mentions American companies such as Walmart, Adidas, and Target, among others, as employing sweatshop labor. Now we have to ask ourselves, why do these companies employ workers from other countries in these poor conditions? The answer is that they know that in these countries it is possible to offer employment with low wages and poor working conditions, something they couldn't really do in the United States, and furthermore, that there will be people in those countries who will accept that offer of employment. If that wasn't the case, then there would really be no reason for those companies to offer jobs there in the first place, which is one reason why some worry that simply taking away sweatshop labor will not necessarily benefit those workers. So those companies are taking advantage of the desperate circumstances of the people living there, although again, they did not create those desperate circumstances. But does sweatshop labor meet the second component of the definition? Does it inflict an undeserved loss upon sweatshop workers? In one sense, it does not, and that is because in an absolute sense, it doesn't actually inflict a loss at all. Sweatshop labor is actually a net gain insofar as, again, it is their best available employment option. However, there is another sense in which sweatshop labor could be seen as an undeserved loss. Specifically, it is a loss relative to what conditions and pay we think workers are entitled to. It is true that sweatshop labor makes workers better off than they would be without it if it just didn't exist, but it still doesn't fairly compensate them for their labor. By comparison, imagine you lent a friend $20 and that your friend promised to pay you back by the end of the day on Friday. Yet when Friday rolls around, your friend only has $5 for you. In an absolute sense, the $5 made you better off. You're better off having the $5 than not having anything at all. Yet the fact still remains that you deserve the $20. Sweatshop labor then can be seen to inflict a similar sort of undeserved loss. It does improve the conditions of laborers when compared to any other available alternative, but it does not provide a working environment that respects their human dignity, nor does it fairly compensate them for the labor they provide. In the discussion questions section of this case study, our author asks us to evaluate the following claim: a sweatshop job is better than no job at all. Now, it may very well be true that in some sense, a sweatshop job is better than no job. However, that doesn't mean that sweatshop jobs give workers what they deserve. Consequently, it could still be the case that sweatshop jobs are unfair and exploitative.